They were tired, they were hungry, they were cold, they were filthy, and they were followed everywhere by a shadow. Heavy clouds filled the sky again. Over the grey waste of water, Malcolm paddled all the next day, while Lyra cried fretfully, and Alice lay indifferently in the bow. Whenever they saw a hilltop or a roof rising above the water, Malcolm stopped, tied up, built a fire, and one or the other of them attended to Lyra. Sometimes Malcolm didn't know whether it was him doing it or it was Alice. And everywhere they went, something went with them, behind. Just beyond the edge of eyesight, something that flickered and vanished, and then appeared again when they looked at something else. They both saw it. It was the only thing they talked about, and neither could see it fully. "If it was night," said Malcolm, "it'd be a night gust." "Well, it ain't. Night, I mean, I hope it's gone by the time it gets dark. Shut up. I didn't want to think about that." "Thanks for nothing." She sounded like the old Alice, the first Alice, scornful and bitter. Malcolm had hoped that that Alice had gone for good, but there she was again, sprawling and scowling and sneering. And he couldn't look at her now anyway, without an electric tension in his body that he only part understood, and part delighted in, and part feared. And he couldn't talk to Asta about it because they were all so close together in the canoe, and in any case, he felt that his Damon was enthralled to it too, whatever it was, this bewitchment. The landscape was changing as they got further down the great flood towards London. Scenes of devastation began to emerge, the shells of houses, their roofs torn off, furniture and clothing strewn all around or caught in bushes and trees, and the trees themselves, stripped of their branches and sometimes of their bark, standing stark and dead under the grey sky. An oratory, its tower lying full length on the sodden ground, with enormous bronze bells scattered beside it, their mouths full of mud and leaves. And all the time, never quite forgotten, never fully seen, the shadow. Malcolm tried to catch it by turning suddenly to the left or to the right, but all he saw was the swift movement that showed where it had been a moment before. Asta watched behind, but she had just the same experience. Whenever she looked, it had just moved away. Wouldn't matter if it felt friendly, Malcolm muttered to her, but it didn't. It felt as if it was hunting them, seated as they were, with Alice in the bow looking back over the stern. She was more aware of things behind them than Malcolm was, and 2 or 3 times during the day she'd seen something else to worry about. "Is that them?" she said. "The CCD? Is that their boat?" Malcolm tried to turn and look, but he was so stiff from paddling that it hurt to twist his body, and besides, the heavy grey of the sky and the dark grey of the wind-whipped water made it hard to see anything. Once he thought he could distinguish the CCD colours of navy blue and ochre, and Asta became a wolf cub and uttered an involuntary little howl. But the boat, if that was what it was, soon faded into the murky haze. Late in the afternoon the clouds darkened, and they heard a rumble of thunder. It was going to rain. "We'd better stop next place we see," said Malcolm. "We'll put the tarpaulin up." "Yeah," said Alice wearily. And then, alarmed, "Look, it's them again." This time, when Malcolm turned round, he saw the beam of a searchlight, brilliant against the gloomy sky, sweeping from left to right. "They just switched it on," Alice said. "They'll see us any minute now. They're coming fast." Malcolm dug the paddle into the water with limbs that were trembling with fatigue. There was no point in trying to outpace the CCD boat. They'd have to hide, and the only hiding place in sight was a wooded hill with an overgrown grassy space just above the waterline. Malcolm made for it, as quickly as he could. It was getting darker rapidly, and the first big drops of rain splashed onto his head and hands. "Not here," said Alice. "I hate this place. I don't know what it is, but it's horrible. There's nowhere else." "No, I know. But it's horrible." Malcolm brought the canoe up onto the lank and sodden grass under a yew tree, tied the painter urgently to the nearest branch, and hastened to fix the hoops into their brackets. Lyra, feeling raindrops on her face, woke up and protested, but Alice ignored her, pulling the coal silk over the hoops and fastening it as Malcolm instructed her. The sound of the engine grew louder and closer. They got the canopy fixed and sat still, Alice holding Lyra tight and whispering to keep her quiet, Malcolm hardly daring to breathe. The searchlight shone through the thin coal silk, illuminating every corner of their little enclosed world. And Malcolm imagined the canoe from the outside, hoping passionately that the regular green shape wouldn't show up in the mass of irregular shadows. Lyra looked around solemnly, and their three daemons clung together on the thwart. The searchlight shone directly at them for seconds that felt like minutes, but then it swung away and the engine noise changed as the steersman opened the throttle and moved off along the flood. Malcolm could hardly hear it over the rain hammering on the canopy. Alice opened her eyes and breathed out. "I wish we'd stopped somewhere else," she said. "You know what this place is." "What?" "It's a graveyard. It's got one of them little houses where they bury people." "A mausoleum," said Malcolm, who had seen the word but never heard it, and pronounced it to rhyme with linoleum. "Is that what it is?" "Well, I don't like it, me neither. But there wasn't anywhere else. We'll just have to keep tight in the canoe and go as soon as we can." "How are we going to feed her, then?" said Alice. "Or wash her? You going to build a fire in the boat? We'll have to wash her in cold water, and—" "Don't be stupid. We can't do that. She's got to have a hot bottle anyway. What's the matter? Why are you angry?" "Everything." "What do you think?" He shrugged. There was nothing he could do about everything. He didn't want to argue. He wanted the searchlight to go away and never come back. He wanted to talk about the garden under the ground and wonder with her what it meant. He wanted to tell her what he'd seen beyond the fog bank. He wanted to tell her about the witch and the wild dogs and wonder what they meant. He wanted to talk about the shadow they felt was following them and agree that it was nothing and laugh about it. He wanted her to admire him for mending the crack in the hull. He wanted her to call him Mal. He wanted Lyra to feel warm and clean and happy and well-fed. But none of that was going to happen. The rain beat on the cold silk with more force every minute. It was so loud that he didn't even notice Lyra crying until Alice leaned forward and picked her up. Even when she was cross with him, she was always patient with Lyra, he thought. Maybe there'd be some dry wood under the trees. If he went out now, he could get it inside the boat before it got too wet. Maybe the rain would stop soon. Presently there came another crack of thunder, but further away, and shortly after that the rain did stop coming down so hard, and then it eased off until the only drops falling on the tarpaulin were what dripped down from the branches above. Malcolm lifted the edge of the canopy. Everything around was still dripping, and the air was as wet as a sodden sponge, full of the smells of dank vegetation, of rot, of earth crawling with worms. Nothing but earth and water and air, and all he wanted was fire. "I'm going to look for some wood," he said. "Don't go too far," she said, alarmed at once. "No, but we've got to have some if we want a fire. Just don't go out of sight, all right? You got the torch?" "Yes. The battery is nearly dead, though. I can't keep it on all the time." The moon was still large, and the clouds thin as they raced away after the storm, so there was some light from the sky. But under the yew trees it was horribly dark. Malcolm stumbled more than once on gravestones that had half sunk into the soil or were simply hidden in the long grass, and all the time kept an eye on that little building of stone, where bodies were laid to rot without being buried. And everything was saturated, whether with rain or dew or the remains of the flood. Everything he touched was heavy and soaked and rotten. His heart was just like that. He would never manage to light any of it. But behind the mausoleum, in the dim light of the torch, he found a stack of old fence posts. They were soaking wet, but when he broke one over his knee, with great effort, he found that inside it was dry. He could shave some tinder off it, and there were always Bonneville's notes, 5 volumes of them. "Don't think of doing that," whispered Asta. She was a lemur perching on his shoulder, her eyes wide. They'd burn well. But he knew he wouldn't do that, not even if they were desperate. He gathered up 6 of the fence posts and brought them around to the front of the mausoleum, where a thought struck him. He shone the torch at the door. It was closed with a padlock. "What do you think?" he whispered to Asta. "Would. They can't hurt us if they're dead," she whispered back. The padlock didn't look very strong, and it was easy to thrust the end of a fence post behind it and pull down hard. The lock snapped and fell away. One push, and the door was open. Malcolm looked in cautiously. The air smelled of age and dry rot and damp, but of nothing worse than that. In the dimly flickering light, they saw rows of shelves, with coffins neatly placed on them. And the wood of the coffins was perfectly dry, as he found when he touched one. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the occupant of the first, "but I need your coffin. They'll give you another one, don't worry." The lid was screwed down, but the screws were brass, so they hadn't rusted tight, and he had his knife with him. Only a few minutes later, he had the lid off and split into long pieces. The skeleton inside didn't worry him, he found, partly because he was expecting it, and anyway he'd seen worse than that. It must have been a woman, he thought, because around the neck, or where the flesh of the neck had been long ago, was a golden necklace, and there were gold rings on 2 of the bony fingers. Malcolm thought about it, and then lifted them all gently away and tucked them down beneath the frail velvet the skeleton was lying on. "To keep him safe," he whispered. "Sorry about your lid, ma'am. Truly sorry, but we need it bad." He set the pieces of the lid against the stone shelf and splintered them with a series of kicks. The coffin's wood was as dry as its occupant, and perfect for burning. He closed the mausoleum and hung the broken padlock in place, so that it looked, at a quick glance, as if nothing had happened. He turned back towards the canoe, signaling once with the torch to let Alice know he was there, and then he saw the shadow. It was formed like a man. He only saw it for a second, and then it darted away. But he knew it at once. It wasn't a shadow at all. It was Bonneville. It had been crouching beside the boat. There was no one else it could have been. The shock was horrible, and he instantly felt even more vulnerable, not knowing where it had gone. "Did you see?" he whispered. "Yes." He hurried across the gravestone-strewn grass, falling twice, bashing his knee, with Asta darting beside him as a cat, stopping to help, encouraging, watching all around. Alice had been singing a nursery rhyme. She heard his panting, stumbling approach and stopped, and called, "Mal?" "Yeah, it's me." He played the feeble torch beam on the canopy, and then shone it all around on the dark yews, the dripping branches, the sodden ground. And of course saw no shadow, no Bonneville. "Did you find some wood?" said Alice from the canoe. "Yeah, a bit, maybe enough." His voice was shaking, but he could do nothing about it. "What's the matter?" she said, lifting the canopy. "You see," summing, she was instantly terrified. She knew quite well what he'd seen, and he knew it. "No, it was just a mistake," he said. He looked around again, but it took courage. The shadow, Bonneville, could have been hiding among the darkness, under any of the trees, behind any of the 4 columns at the entrance to the mausoleum, or, in the form of something small, behind any of the gravestones. And where was the hyena Damon? But no, he must be imagining it. They couldn't just paddle away, because this was the only land they'd seen, and it was dark, and out there on the water was the CCD boat, and Lyra needed food and warmth now. Malcolm breathed deeply and tried to stop himself shaking. "I'll make a fire here," he said. With the knife he split some tinder from one of the splintered planks and set a fire on the grass. His hands were only just strong enough to do the work. But it caught at once, and soon one of their last bottles of water was heating in the little saucepan. He tried not to look up from the flames. The little flicker of the fire made the surrounding darkness even deeper, and made every shadow move. Lyra was crying steadily, a quiet lament of unhappiness. When Alice undressed her, she just lay there without even trying to move. Asta and Ben tried to comfort Pantalaimon, but he wriggled free. He wanted to be with the little pale form that could only weep and weep. The coffin lid burned well, and there was enough of it to warm Lyra's milk, but only just. As soon as Alice had her dressed and feeding, the last of the wood flared up in a single yellow flame and went out, and Malcolm kicked the ashes away and gladly got in the canoe. His arms ached, his back ached, his heart ached. The thought of setting off again over the unforgiving water was horrible, even if there'd been no CCD boat searching for them. Body, mind, and Damon longed for the oblivion of sleep. "Is there any of that candle left?" said Alice. "A bit, I think." He rummaged among the jumble of stuff they'd taken from the pharmacy so long ago, and found a piece of candle about as long as his thumb. He lit it, let a little molten wax gather around the wick, and tilted it out onto the thwart and set the candle upright in it. He could still do simple, everyday things then. He hadn't lost the power to live from second to second, and to take pleasure even, in the warm yellow light that filled the canoe. Lyra twisted in Alice's arms and looked at the candle. Her thumb found her mouth, and she gazed solemnly at the little yellow flame. "What did you see?" Alice whispered. "Nothing. It was him, wasn't it? It might have—" "No. It just looked like him for a second. Then what? Then nothing. It wasn't there. There was nothing there. We should have made sure of him. Back there, when he nearly got us. We should have done him in proper— When someone dies," he said. What happens to their daemon? They just vanish." "Don't talk about this," said Asta. And Alice's terrier Damon, Ben, said, "Yeah, don't say those things. Then when there's a ghost, or a nightgast," Malcolm said, ignoring them. "Is that the dead person's daemon? I dunno. And could someone's body move around and do things if their daemon was dead? You never get a person without a daemon. It's impossible because—" "Shut up," said Ben. "Because it hurts too much when you try and pull apart. But I've heard that in some places there can be people without daemons. Maybe they're just dead bodies walking around. But maybe—" "Don't stop talking about that," said Asta, and became a terrier, like Ben, and they growled together. But her voice had been terrified. Then Lyra complained. Alice turned back to her. "Listen, darling, your milk's all gone. Special treat now, all right? I got a bag full of canopies." She reached into the bag and pulled out a bit of toast that had once had a quail's egg on it. "You eat the toast and I'll find the little egg. Little tiny egg. You'll like that." Lyra took the toast willingly enough and brought it to her mouth. "You get them from the garden?" said Malcolm stupidly. "I nicked a whole lot of stuff from the waiters that went past. They never noticed. There's enough for us and all. Here you are." She leaned forward, holding out something the size of Lyra's palm, brown and squashed. It turned out to be a miniature spicy fish cake. "I suppose," he said with his mouth full. "If she eats enough toast and stuff, it won't matter so much if we run out of—" He heard something from outside. But it wasn't something. It wasn't just an abstract noise, a sound with no meaning. It was the word Alice, and it was spoken softly in the voice of Bonneville. She froze. He couldn't help looking at her, just as children in a classroom can't help looking at the pupil whose name is spoken by a teacher in the tone that means trouble and punishment. He looked for a reaction, instinctively, and at once regretted it. She was terrified. Her face lost all its color. Her eyes widened, she bit her lip, and he had stared at her like the child who was safe. He hated himself. "You don't have to," he whispered. "Shut up. Keep quiet." They both listened, sitting like statues, straining to hear. Lyra went on sucking and munching at her toast, unaware of anything wrong. And there was no voice, just the wind passing through the yew trees, just the occasional lapping of water against the hull. Something strange was happening to the candle. Its flame was burning. It was giving out light, but it had a shadow. The searchlight was back. Alice gasped and put her hand over her mouth, then immediately took it away and held it close to Lyra to stifle any cry from her. Malcolm saw it all clearly in the cold glare through the canopy, and he could hear the engine noise too. After a few moments the full beam swung away from them, but there was still light nearby, as if the searchers were looking more slowly along the edge, where the water met the graveyard. "Here," whispered Alice. "Take Lyra, because I'm going to faint." Very carefully, avoiding the candle, she passed the child to him. Lyra came placidly enough, happy with her toast. Alice was pale, but she didn't look like fainting. He thought if she really felt faint, she wouldn't be able to say so. She'd just sink down into oblivion. Malcolm watched her closely. It wasn't only the light that had frightened her. There'd been that whisper of her name in Bonneville's voice. She looked at the very edge of terror. She sat back and suddenly turned to her left, the side closer to the bank. She was listening. Malcolm could hear a whisper. Her eyes grew wider, more full of horror or loathing, and she didn't seem to be aware of him or of Lyra anymore, just of that insistent whisper through the coal silk at her side. "Alice," he began again, desperate to help. "Shut up." She put her hands over her ears. Ben, terrier-formed, was standing with his back legs on her lap, his forepaws on the gunwale, intent like her on the whisper, which Malcolm could hear now, though he couldn't distinguish the words. Expressions flitted over Alice's face like the shadows of swift clouds on an April morning, but these expressions were all fear, or disgust, or horror, and looking at her, Malcolm felt he would never see sunlight on a spring morning again. So deep was the anguish and loathing the girl was feeling. Then the tarpaulin rippled next to her, and Ben jumped back, and then a slit appeared in the coal silk canopy as a knife point moved down it, and then a man's hand reached through and seized Alice by the throat. Alice tried to scream, but the grip on her throat choked her voice, and then the hand moved down her front, to her lap, searching for something else, feeling left and right, trying to find Lyra. Alice was moaning, struggling to get away from the loathsome touch, and Ben, terrier, formed, seized the man's wrist in his teeth, despite the disgust it must have caused him. And then, finding no Lyra, Bonneville's hand grabbed the little Damon and snatched him out through the slit in the canopy, out into the dark, away from Alice. "Ben! Ben!" Alice cried, and stumbled up, and fell across the thwart and half out of the canoe, and then scrambled up and was gone after them. Malcolm reached for her, meaning to hold her back, but she was gone before he could touch her. The hyena Damon laughed, just a couple of feet from Malcolm's ears, splitting the night with her "Ha! Ha! Hi!" And there was an additional note in the laughter, like a scream of agony. Lyra, terrified by the sound, began to cry, and Malcolm rocked her closely while he called, "Alice! Alice!" Asta, cat-formed, put her paws on the gunwale and tried to look out from under the canopy, but Malcolm knew she could see nothing. Pantalaimon was fluttering here and there, a moth, landing on Lyra's hand for a moment and flying away again, blundering close to the candle flame and fleeing in fear, and finally settling on the child's damp hair. From the direction of the mausoleum there came a high, hopeless cry, not a scream, just a desperate wail of protest. Malcolm's heart clenched. Then there was just the sound of the baby crying in his arms and the water lapping, and a soft, keening sob from Asta, a puppy, pressing herself against his side. "I'm not old enough for this," Malcolm thought, almost aloud. He cuddled the child close and pulled the blanket up around her before setting her down among the cushions. Guilt and rage and fear fought one another in his mind. He thought he'd never been more awake in all his life. He thought he'd never sleep again. He thought this was the worst night he'd ever known. His head was full of thunder. He thought his skull would crack open. "Asta!" he gasped. "I've got to go to Alice." But Lyra, "Can't leave her. Go," she said. "Yes, go. I'll stay. I won't leave her. It'll hurt so much. But we have to. I'll guard Lyra. I won't move, promise." His eyes were streaming with hot tears. He kissed Lyra over and over again, and then held puppy Asta to his heart, to his face, to his lips. He set her down next to the child, and she became a leopard cub. So beautiful he sobbed with love, and he stood up so carefully, so gently, that the canoe didn't rock or move an inch, and he took the paddle and climbed out. Immediately the deep pain of separation began, and he heard a stifled moan from the canoe behind him. It was like struggling to climb up a steep slope, with his lungs clamoring for air and his heart hammering at his ribs. But it was worse, because inside the pain, and coloring it, deepening it, poisoning it, there was the horrible guilt of hurting his dearest Asta so much. She was shaking with love and pain, and she was so brave. Her eyes were watching him with such devotion as he slowly, unforgivably wrenched his body away from her, as if he was leaving her behind forever. But he had to. He forced himself through the pain, which he knew was tearing at her leopard form without mercy. He dragged himself away from the little boat and up the slope to the dark mausoleum, because something was doing something to Alice, and she was crying in wild protest. And the hyena Damon, both her front legs gone, was half standing, half lying on the grass, with Ben, the terrier, in her foul jaws. Ben writhed and kicked and bit and howled, and the monstrous jaws and teeth of Bonneville's Damon were closing, slowly, voluptuously, ecstatically, on his little form. Then the moon came out. There was Bonneville in clear sight, his hands gripping Alice's wrists, holding her down on the steps. The cold light was reflected in the hyena's eyes, and in Bonneville's too, and from the tears on Alice's cheeks. It was the worst thing Malcolm had ever seen, and he tore himself through the pain and lurched and stumbled up the slippery grass and raised the paddle and brought it down on the man's back, but feebly, too feebly. Bonneville twisted, saw Malcolm, and laughed out loud. Alice cried and tried to force the man away, but he slammed her down hard, and she screamed. Malcolm tried to hit him again. The moon shone brilliantly on the sodden grass, the mossy gravestones, the crumbling mausoleum, the figures in their hideous embrace between the columns. Malcolm felt something grow inside him that he couldn't argue with or control, and it was like a herd of wild dogs, snarling and howling and snapping, racing towards him with their torn ears and blind eyes and bloodied muzzles. And then they were all around him, and through him, and he whirled the paddle again, and caught the hyena Damon on the shoulder. "Ah!" said Bonneville, and fell clumsily. The hyena growled. Malcolm hit her again, full on the head, and she lurched and slid away, her back legs slipping on the grass, her chest and throat bearing all the weight of her as she crushed little Ben. One more blow from the paddle, and Ben fell out of her jaws and scrambled up towards Alice. But Bonneville saw him and kicked out at him, sending him tumbling away over the grass. Alice cried out in pain. The dogs howled and snarled, and what happened was that Malcolm whirled the paddle again and caught Bonneville hard on the back of the head. "Tell me," Malcolm raged, though he couldn't finish the command, and he tried to hold the dogs back with the paddle, but they surged forward again, and Malcolm struck once more, and the figure fell full length with a long, expiring moan. Malcolm turned to the imaginary dogs. He felt his eyes throwing fire, but he also knew in that fraction of a second that without the dogs he would find himself giving way to pity, and only with their help could he punish the figure who had hurt Alice. But if he didn't hold them off, he'd never know what Bonneville could tell him. And yet he didn't know what to ask, and if he held them off for a moment too long, they'd go away and take all that power with them. He thought all that in less than a second. Malcolm turned back to the dying figure. The dogs howled, and Malcolm whirled the paddle again and struck the arm that came up in defense. He had never hit anything so hard. The figure cried out, "Go on, kill me, you little shit. Peace at last." The dogs surged again, and the man flinched even before Malcolm had moved. If he hit him again, Malcolm knew he'd kill him, and all the time the terrible, draining separation pain exhausted him, and the knowledge of his brave, abandoned Damon, guarding the little child, drenched him with misery. "What's the Rusakov field?" he managed to say. "Why is it important?" "Dust." It was the last word Bonneville said, hardly more than a whisper. The dogs were milling around, leaderless. Malcolm thought of Alice, of the fairy arranging her hair, of her sleep-warmed cheeks, and of how it felt to hold baby Lyra in his arms, and the dogs felt his emotion, and turned around and leapt forward once more, through Malcolm, and he raised the paddle, and struck again and again, till the Bonneville figure fell still. The groaning stopped, all was silent, the hyena Damon had vanished, and Malcolm was left standing over the body of the man who had pursued them so madly and for so long. Malcolm's arms, strengthened by days of paddling, now ached with exhaustion. The weight of the paddle itself was too much for him. He dropped it. The dogs had gone. He sat down suddenly and leaned against one of the columns. Bonneville's body lay half in and half out of the dazzling moonlight. A trickle of blood ran slowly down, joining the rain puddles still lying on the steps. Alice's eyes were closed. There was blood on her cheek, blood dripping down her leg, blood in her fingernails. She was shaking. She wiped her mouth and lay back on the wet stone, looking like a broken bird. Ben was a mouse trembling at her neck. "Alice," he whispered, "where's Asta?" She mumbled through bruised lips. "How? She's guarding Lyra. We had to separate." "Oh, Mal," she said, "just that," and he felt that all the pain had been worth it. He wiped his face. "We ought to drag him down to the water," he said shakily. "Yeah, all right. Go slowly." Malcolm pulled his painful body upright and bent to grasp the man's feet. He began to pull. Alice forced herself up and helped, hauling at a sleeve. The body was heavy, but it came without resistance, without even snagging on the half-buried gravestones. They came to the water's edge, where the flood was flowing strongly. The CCD boat and its searchlight had gone. They rolled the dead man clumsily over until the current took him away, and then stood clinging to each other and watching the dark shape, darker on the dark water, drift off with the flood till it had vanished. The candle was still burning in the canoe. They found Lyra fast asleep and Asta, at the end of her strength, lying beside her. Malcolm lifted up his daemon and hugged her close, and they both wept. Alice climbed into the canoe and lay trembling as Ben, terriformed, licked and licked at her, cleaning the blood from every part. Then she pulled a blanket over them both and turned away and closed her eyes. Malcolm picked up the child and lay down with her in his arms, and their daemons between them, and the blankets wrapped around them both. The last thing he did was to pinch out the candle. The flood was at its height by this time. All across southern England houses and villages were devastated. Large buildings were swept away. Farm animals were drowned. And as for people, the number of missing or dead was, for the time being, uncountable. The authorities, both local and national, had to spend every penny in their treasuries and every second of time in the sole task of dealing with the chaos. Among all the other activities, desperate and urgent as they all were, the two sides that were searching for Malcolm and Lyra made their way steadily downstream towards the capital city. They followed rumors, of which there were many. They ignored every cry for help from the beleaguered people on all sides. They had eyes and minds only for a boy and a girl in a canoe with a baby, and for a man with a three-legged hyena daemon. Like Lord Nugent, George Papadimitriou had experienced the sense of strangeness and unreality that the flood produced. The Egyptian owner of the boat he was travelling on told him that in Egyptian law extreme weather had its own states of mind, just as calm weather did. "How can the weather have a state of mind?" said Papadimitriou. The Egyptian said, "You think the weather is only out there. It's in here, too," and tapped his head. "So do you mean that the weather's state of mind is just our state of mind?" "Nothing is just anything," the Egyptian replied, and would say no more. They moved on with the flood, speaking to anyone they could find, asking about the canoe and the boy and the girl. Yes, they'd been seen the day before, but no, it wasn't a canoe, it was a dinghy with an outboard engine. Yes, some people had seen them, but they were dead in their boat, or they were water ghasts, or they were armed with guns. And over again they were spirits. It was bad luck to talk to them. They came from the fairy world. Papadimitriou accepted all this nonsense with serious attention. The CCD in their search would be hearing the same rumors. The problem was not to judge their truthfulness, but to assess the likely reaction of the other side. Nugent and Schlesinger would be faced with just the same problem, and every hour they came closer to London. The morning light, as cold and merciless as it could be, woke Malcolm up far earlier than he liked, aching in every muscle and aching in his mind when images of the night came back to him. He struggled to sit up and assemble his senses. Alice was asleep, and so was the child, still and warm in his arms. He wished he hadn't woken. He knew he'd have to wake them, and he wished he could let them sleep. He looked out from under the canopy. The graveyard looked even worse than it had during the night, when the moonlight had at least given it a silvery coherence. In the cruel light of the morning, it looked squalid, neglected, overgrown. And there was something worse. The steps of the little mausoleum were stained with blood, a great deal of it. For a moment, Malcolm felt sick, and closed his eyes and held himself steady. Then the feeling passed. Moving very slowly so as not to waken Lyra, he laid her down among the blankets and climbed out of the canoe, to stand shivering on the sodden grass, taking Asta in his arms. With her now so close, he felt more shaken, sadder, more guilty, much older. She pressed her cat face into his neck. She had been hurt too when they pulled apart. One day, perhaps, they'd be able to talk about it, but for now, he felt full of sorrow and regret that he'd hurt her. If it was like his, the pain she was feeling was so deep that it seemed to inhabit every atom of her. "We couldn't do anything else," she whispered. "We had to. It's true. We did." Could he wash the blood away? Would the steps ever be clean again? His body quailed. "Mal, where are you?" Alice's voice was faint. He lifted the canopy and saw her face blurred with sleep and still bloody from the night. He reached into the boat and took one of the crumpled towels and dragged it through the grass to moisten it. She took it silently and dabbed her eyes and cheeks. Then she climbed out too, very painfully, shivering and teeth chattering, and reached in for Lyra. The child badly needed a change of nappy. She was drowsy. Instead of her usual lively chatter, she grizzled unhappily. And Pantalaimon lay limply as a mouse against her neck. "Her cheeks are red," Malcolm said. "Probably caught a cold, and we only got one nappy left. I don't think we can go on much longer." "Well, we got to have a fire, Mal. We got to clean her, and we got to feed her. I'll get some more wood." He reached in for the paddle, intending first to wash the blood off it, and found a catastrophe. "Oh, God, what is it?" The paddle was broken. What he'd done in the night had snapped the shaft. The blade and the handle still held together, but only just any strain, the slightest push against the water, would break it off entirely. Malcolm turned it over in his hands, dismayed beyond expression. "Mal, what's the matter?" And then, "Oh God, what's happened? The paddle's broken. If I use it, it'll just snap. I wish I'd, if only I'd." He was nearly in tears. "Can you mend it?" "I could mend it, if I had a workshop and tools." She was looking around. "First things first," she said. "We got to have a fire." "I could burn this," he said bitterly. "No, don't do that. Get some wood. Try to light a fire, Mal. It's really important." He looked at the listless little child in her arms. The unhappy Damon pressed so close against her neck. Her eyes half closed. She looked ill and weak. He put the paddle carefully in the canoe. "Don't touch that," he said. "If it comes apart altogether, it'll be harder to mend. I'll find something to burn." He went with slow, reluctant steps up the slope to the mausoleum, avoiding the still damp blood, and opened the door. He looked respectfully at the coffin he'd opened the night before and murmured, "Good morning, and sorry again, ladies and gentlemen. I'm only doing this because we really need to. Another fence post, another coffin lid, another skeleton to apologize to, another fire to build." A few minutes later, the saucepan was heating almost the last of their clean water, and he went to search among the heap of fence posts for something to mend the paddle with. The problem was not finding something to bind it to. It was finding something to bind it with. Twine, string, any kind of cord. But there was nothing of that sort anywhere. The best thing he could find was a length of rusty wire. He dragged it out of the heap of fence posts, hauling it loose from the ones it was stapled to, and began to work on the paddle. The wire was stiff and stubborn, and he couldn't wrap it very tightly, but there it was. It was all he had. And there was enough of it to go around several times, so even if the blade broke away completely, it would still be held in a cage of wire. His hands were cut and scraped, and covered in blood-red rust. He rinsed them in the floodwater, and noticed that the canoe wasn't floating anymore, but resting on the grass beneath. "The water's going down," he said. "About bloody time," said Alice. He was impatient to be going, and so was she. They got back in the canoe, settled Alice and the child as comfortably as they could, and pushed off once more onto the flood. The rest of that day was dull going. under a cold grey sky, but they made a fair distance, by Malcolm's reckoning. And the water was going down, and the land they were passing through was more and more urban. There were houses to left and right, roads and shops, and even some people moving about, wading along the streets. The paddle felt loose and weak, but he didn't have to push against the current after all. He used it mainly to steer, and he kept as close into the bank as he could without danger. He and Alice looked intently at the places they passed, because they were both aware, without saying anything about it, of the state Lyra was in. "Go down there," said Alice suddenly, pointing to a street of little shops at right angles to the current. It was a struggle to get the canoe to turn and go back, with every nerve in Malcolm's arms aware of exactly how much strain it was putting on the paddle. But finally he had them safely in the backwater that had been a street, and moving laboriously up along the shop fronts. "There," said Alice, pointing to a pharmacy. It was closed and dark, of course, but there was someone moving about inside. Malcolm hoped it wasn't a looter. He brought the canoe up next to the door and tapped on the glass. "Hold her up so he can see," he said to Alice. The man inside came to the door and looked out. Not an unfriendly face, Malcolm thought, but anxious and preoccupied. "We need some medicine," he shouted, pointing at Lyra, who lolled pale in Alice's arms. The man peered at her and nodded. He gestured, "Come round to the back." An alleyway between his shop and the next led to an open door, and the water inside the shop was just as high as it was outside, up to Malcolm's thighs, in fact, as he found when he stepped out and tied the canoe to a drain pipe. It was so cold it shook his heart. "You better come," he said to Alice. "You can explain what we need." He took Lyra while Alice got out, gasping at the shock of the cold. He held on to the child as they made their way into the shop. "I hope the stuff we need ain't on the low shelves," he said. "What is it?" he said, not unkindly. "It's our little sister," Malcolm said. "She's ill. We got swept down in the flood, and we've been trying to look after her." "But—" The man pulled back Lyra's blanket to look at her face and put the back of his fingers against her forehead. "How old is she?" he said. 8 months, said Alice. "We just run out of milk powder, and we got nothing else to give her, and we need more nappies, the throwaway ones. Anything babies need, really. And medicine. Where are you going?" "Since we got swept away in the flood, we ain't been able to go back home, which is Oxford," Malcolm explained. "So we're trying to get to Chelsea, where her father lives." "She's your sister?" "Yes." "She's Ellie, and I'm Richard, and this is Sandra." "Whereabouts in Chelsea?" The man seemed twitchy, as if he was trying to listen for something else as well as Malcolm's answer. "March Road," Alice said before Malcolm could speak. "But can you give us some of the things she needs? We ain't got any money to pay. Please, we're ever so worried about her." The man was about the age of Malcolm's father. He looked as if he might be a father himself. "Let's go and see what we can find," he said loudly, with a false cheerfulness. They splashed their way through into the front of the shop, where they found a chaos of floating bottles, tubes, cardboard packets gone soggy. "I don't know if we'll ever recover from this," he said. "The amount of stock that's ruined. Now, first of all, give her a spoonful of this." He reached up to a top shelf and took down a box containing a little bottle of medicine and a spoon. "What is it?" said Malcolm. "It'll make her feel better. A spoonful every couple of hours. How's her teeth? She started teething yet?" "She's got a couple," said Alice. "And I think her gums are sore. Maybe there's more coming." "Let her chew one of these," said the pharmacist, taking a box of hard biscuits from a shelf just above where the water had reached. "What else was it?" "Milk powder." "Oh, yes, lucky about that too." "Oh, here you are. This is a different sort from the one we had. Are they made up the same?" "They're all made up the same." "How do you heat the water?" "We make a fire. We got a saucepan." "That's how we heat her washing water too." "Very resourceful. I'm impressed. Anything else?" "Nappies?" "Oh, yes. They're on the bottom shelf, so none of these will do. I'll see if there's any out the back." Malcolm was pouring some of the medicine into the spoon. "Can you hold her up?" he said, and then whispered, "There's someone else here." He's gone out to talk to 'em. I hope it's nice, else she'll spit it out, said Alice, and then whispered, I seen her. She's keeping out of sight. Come on, Lyra, said Malcolm. Sit up now. Come on, love, open your mouth. He put a drop of the pink liquid on her lips. Lyra woke up and began to complain, and then tasted something strange and smacked her lips. Tastes nice. Here's another drop, said Malcolm. Alice was looking intently at the reflections in the glass of a medicine cabinet. I can see 'em. He's whispering to her, and she's going out, she muttered. Bastards. We'd better move off quick. The shopkeeper came back. Here you are, he said. I thought I had a few packets left. Anything else you need? Can I take one of these rolls of adhesive tape? Malcolm asked. You'd be better off with individual bandages, wouldn't you? I need it to mend something. Go on, then. That's very kind of you, sir. Thank you very much. What are you going to eat? We got some biscuits and things, Malcolm said, as impatient to be away as Alice was. Let me go next door. See if I can find you something from the grocer's. I'm sure he won't mind. You wait here a minute. Tell you what. Go upstairs, get out of the water, warm up a bit. Thank you very much, but we got to move on, said Alice. Oh, no. Keep the little one out of the cold for a while. You all look as if you could do with a rest. No, thank you, said Malcolm. We'll go. Thank you very much for these things. We don't want to wait. The shopkeeper kept insisting, but they moved out and got back into the canoe, cold and wet as they were, and pushed off straight away. He was trying to keep us there while his wife went for the police, said Alice quietly, watching him over Malcolm's shoulder as he paddled them down to the main stream. Or the CCD. As soon as they were clear, Malcolm pulled off the rusty wire and wrapped the roll of adhesive tape as tightly as he could around the paddle. It felt better than the wire, but it had little strength, and it wouldn't last very long, but perhaps they didn't have much further to go. He said so to Alice. We'll see, she said. Over the centuries, the engineers and builders of the Corporation of London had learned to make the outward flow of the river and the inward surge of the tide come together more or less smoothly. All the way upriver as far as Teddington, the water level rose when the tide came in and fell when it went out again, and only the skippers and barge owners whose vessels crowded the water and used the city docks took much notice. But the flood had changed everything. Twice a day, as the tide came in up the estuary, the great weight of the flood water leaned its might against the sea and tried to force it back. And until the tide turned and went out again, the two vast masses of contending water roiled and seethed in a wild confusion. All kinds of boating except the most urgent had ceased for the time being. Some barges and lighters held hard to their moorings, though in many cases they were torn loose and swept up or down the river to slam into the embankments, into the wharves and quays or the piers of the great bridges, or to capsize in the surge, or to be carried out to sea and lost. A number of bridges were shaken badly. Only Castle Bridge and Westminster Bridge held fast entirely. Blackfriars, Battersea, and Southwark collapsed, their debris adding to the churning turmoil as the waters met. In the small power boat he'd hired, Bud Schlesinger rode the wild water, scouring the chaos all around with his eyes, and trying to calm the fears of the owner. There's too much debris in the water, the man shouted. It's dangerous. It could smash open the hull. Where's Chelsea? Schlesinger called back from the bow, where he was leaning out and trying to keep the rain out of his eyes. Further on, the owner shouted, We got to pull in and tie up. This is crazy, not yet. Is Chelsea on the left bank or the right? The owner shouted back, Left, followed by a string of curses. The boat plunged on. The embankments on both sides, as far as Schlesinger could see, were under several feet of water, and on the right, a large submerged park spread out beyond a line of great bare trees, whereas on the left, a succession of imposing houses and stately apartment buildings stood silent and deserted. Slow down a little, Bud called, and made his way to the cockpit at the stern. You ever heard of October House? Big white place further down. What the hell's that fool doing? A powerful boat with a navy blue and ochre hull had surged up close, crowding them on the starboard side. A deckhand with a boat hook leaned out and tried to hit Schlesinger, but he swayed back and let it pass in front of him. The man nearly overbalanced, but held onto the rail and swung the boat hook round in another attempt. Schlesinger drew his pistol and fired above the boat, and by sheer luck hit the boat hook, knocking it out of the man's hand. "You can't do that," wailed the owner of Bud's boat, throttling back hard. The bigger boat lunged ahead, but then met some obstruction in the water and reared up suddenly. Bud could see the helmsman wrestling with the wheel, trying to get the vessel to turn to starboard, but clearly there was something impeding the propeller. The engine screamed, and the boat lost way, and in a few seconds was wallowing helplessly behind them. "What the bloody hell?" Bud's helmsman was almost incoherent. "Didn't you see the colors?" "You know what they were." "CCD," said Bud. "We gotta get to October House before they do." "Insane." The man's dog Damon was crouching beside his legs, shivering. The owner shook his head, but pushed the throttle forward a notch. Bud wiped the rain from his eyes and looked all around. In the spray and the confusion there were many shapes on the water, and it was impossible to tell which of them might be a canoe with a boy and a girl and a baby. Half a mile downstream, Lord Nugent's boat slammed into the landing at the foot of a great lawn leading up to a white building in the classical style. The landing stage was under the surface, of course, and it was only the hull of the boat that made contact with it, and there was nowhere to tie up, but Nugent was over the side in a moment, waist deep in the freezing water, and wading, trying to hold his balance in the strong current, up towards what looked like a massive boathouse at the left of the lawn, whose front, open to the surging river, glowed with ambaric light. There were sounds from inside that came clearly even over the storm and the rage of the water, hammering, drilling, a turbine-like whine. Nugent made it, still knee-deep, and grasped the handle of a door on the landward side. He hauled it open and went in. Under the glare of floodlights, no doubt powered by the generator that was thudding just outside the door, half a dozen men were working on a long, slender boat. Nugent couldn't see what they were doing. He had eyes only for the man who was crouching on the foredeck using a welding torch. "Asriel," he called, and hurried forward along the temporary decking towards the boat. Lord Asriel pushed up the mask that covered his face and stood astonished. "Nugent, is that you? What are you doing here? Is this boat ready to go out on the water?" "Yes, but—" "If you want to save your daughter, take it out right now. I'll come with you and explain. Don't waste a second." As La Belle Sauvage floated more and more swiftly down into London, the tide was nearing its height, and the consequences for the little canoe were serious. Slammed this way and that, battered by lurching waves and cross-currents, she kept her course as well as Malcolm could manage. But every time she twisted on the rough water, he heard a creak, as if part of her framework was giving way. If only they could stop. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't stop anywhere. As if the tide wasn't enough, a wind had begun to blow, and was lashing the water into white-topped waves and whipping off the spray. And the sky above, grey and cold and dull all day, had been invaded by hefty rain-bearing thunderclouds. Malcolm kept turning this way and that, to look for a place to put ashore, so as to attend to that horrible creak that he could hear now, even above the wind, and he could feel it too. A sickening twist that began as the merest suspicion of structural looseness, but soon became bigger with every lurch, every sideways rise and fall. "Mal!" Alice called. "I know. Hold on." They were swept onwards past a great palace set so far back in its garden that he could hardly see it through the rain, past streets of elegant brick houses, past a pretty oratory, and whenever he thought he could see shelter, he dug the paddle deep and tried to turn towards it. But it was hopeless, and now the blade was coming loose again, to make everything worse. Through the murk ahead, he could just see 4 huge chimneys on the southern bank, rising from each corner of a great cliff-like building. Were they near Chelsea? And if they were, how could he stop? Alice was holding Lyra tight. He felt a surge of love for them both, of love and of infinite regret that he'd brought them into this. But he couldn't dwell on that, because there was a new sound now, piercing the noise of the wind and the battering rain, A siren, an alarm, shrieking behind them, its cry like a seabird tossed and flung this way and that in the buffeting air. Alice was straining to see over his shoulder, clutching Lyra to her chest, hand up to keep the rain out of her eyes. And at the same time Malcolm heard a clangor of bells from directly ahead. And other sounds came to them on the pummeling wind, the roaring beat of an engine, the creak and howl of great masses of wood. Being crushed together, human cries. Malcolm could focus on none of them. La Belle Sauvage was worrying him to madness. Was she breaking apart? Suddenly there came a massive blow from something behind, a powerboat. Malcolm could hear the engine screaming as the propeller rose out of the water, and hear Alice scream over that, and then feel the thrust and shudder as the propeller plunged into the water again and forced the boat against the little canoe. What were they doing? Alice was shouting. Her words were snatched away like a piece of paper. Another crash, as the navy blue and ochre hull of the powerboat shouldered the canoe sideways in the water, and La Belle Sauvage leaned over and shipped a heavy wave before swinging upright again. Malcolm was fighting now, with every little fraction of his strength, digging the paddle deep, leaning into the stroke, heaving hard, and nursing the broken thing, which was finally coming apart. He snatched off the useless blade and flung it backwards, spinning through the air. Was there a crash of broken glass, a shout of anger? Impossible to hear because now another powerboat, the higher note of a different engine, screamed in from the right and smashed into the first. Malcolm could see nothing. The lashing rain drenched his eyeballs, and the wild confusion of sound and the lurching, smashing, pitching, plunging movements of the canoe were his only guide. And then a gunshot, 2 more, 4 more from a different gun, a sudden immense shock, and immediately the freezing water began to gush in, and nothing would ever stop it now. Another smash against the wounded canoe, this time from the right. A powerful, deep voice, roaring, "Pass her up to me, Lord Asriel." Malcolm wiped his right hand across his eyes and saw Alice trying to hold Lyra away from the hands that reached down, and he screamed, "Alice, it's all right, pass her up." One wild look from her, and he nodded as hard as he could. Pass her up. Again in that harsh, deep shout, and Alice thrust the child up, and Lyra was screaming, and those hands snatched her, thrust her backwards, and then, before Alice could move, seized one of her wrists, and hoisted her instantly up too, as if she weighed no more than the baby. Ben, as a little monkey, was clinging to her waist. The first boat had swung back. Now it smashed into the canoe again. A death blow, and the brave little boat was broken open like an egg. Both Malcolm and Asta cried out with love. "Now, you boy," that huge voice again. Balancing knee-deep in the surging water, Malcolm swung the rucksack up. It was hard to lift with one hand, and those hands from above pushed it aside. You fool. Take this first." Malcolm screamed, and Alice was shouting too. "Take it, take it!" Out of his grasp it sprang upwards and vanished, and then he stood in the sinking canoe with Asta, as a snake coiled tightly around his leg, and an iron-hard hand closed around his right arm and swung him up, and then he fell on a wooden deck with a crash that knocked every scrap of air out of his lungs, and he stared down with rain-lashed, tear-filled eyes as the little Belle Sauvage, smashed to matchwood, died and was borne away forever. Nothing then but noise and the plunging, thumping, swinging of the powerboat on the wild water. Malcolm scrambled across to Alice, dragging the rucksack, and they sat clinging together with the child between them, all their daemons clinging together too, as suddenly the movement stilled. The engine fell silent, and they were inside a great shed with anbaric lights blazing down at them. Malcolm felt a wave of exhaustion move slowly through him from feet to head. Asriel was shouting, "What the hell do you think you were playing at?" Malcolm gathered his strength to sit up and answer, but he had none left. Alice leapt to her feet instead, and stood with fists clenched, facing Lord Asriel, and Ben, her daemon, bristling with defiance as a wolf, bared his teeth beside her. Her voice was like a whip. Playing? You think we were playing? This was Mal's idea. He said we'd bring Lyra to you to keep her safe, because by God there was nowhere else she'd be safe. I was against it because I thought it was impossible, but he was stronger than me, and if he says he'll do something, he'll bloody do it. You don't know nothing about him to ask a stupid question like that. Playing? You dare even think that? If I told you half of what he's done to keep us alive and safe, well, you wouldn't imagine it could be true. You couldn't dream of it. Whatever Mal says, I believe. So take that fucking smile off your face, you— Malcolm was barely conscious now. He thought he was dreaming. But the expression on Lord Israel's face, warm with amusement and admiration for Alice, was too real to be imagined. He dragged himself to his feet and said hoarsely, "Scholastic sanctuary. We tried to get her to Jordan College, but the flood was too strong, and anyway, I don't know the words, the Latin words. So we thought you might." And he held out with trembling fingers the little white card that he'd found in the canoe. Lyra was crying passionately. Once again, Malcolm tried to hold himself steady, but it was too hard altogether. Just before he fainted, he heard someone say, "The boy's bleeding. He's been shot." When he came to, it was in a different space. Small, hot, close to the drumming of a gyropter engine, lit by the glow of an instrument panel. His left arm was ablaze with pain. Where had that come from? Someone squeezed his right hand. It was Alice. "Where's Lyra?" he managed to say. She pointed to the floor. Lyra lay wrapped up as tightly as a mummy, fast asleep, and Pan lay coiled around her neck as a little green snake. Asta was lying, cat-shaped, on Malcolm's lap. He tried to stroke her with his left hand, but that made his arm throb with even more pain. She stood up and rubbed her face against his. "Where are we?" he whispered, "in a gyropter. He's flying it. Where are we going?" He didn't say, "Where's the rucksack? Behind your legs." He felt for it with his right hand. There it was, safe. He felt his left arm delicately and found a rough bandage covering the forearm. "What happened?" he said. "You got shot," said Alice. The gyropter was shaking and swaying, but Alice was calm enough, so Malcolm decided not to be anxious. The engine was so loud and so close that it was difficult to hear each other anyway. He leaned back in the hard seat and fell asleep. Alice adjusted the way he was lying so he wouldn't wake up with a stiff neck. Over the thudding of the engine, she heard Azrael shout something and thought she heard her name. She leaned forward and shouted back, "What? I can't hear you." There was another man in the co-pilot's seat, some sort of servant. He twisted around and handed her earphones, and showed her how to put them on and bring the microphone round in front of her mouth. Suddenly, Lord Asriel's voice was loud and clear. "Listen carefully and don't interrupt. I'm going away, and I won't be back for some time. I want to find the child safe when I come back, and the best way to ensure that is to keep yourself and Malcolm quiet and inconspicuous. You understand what I mean? You think I'm stupid? No, I think you're young. Go back to the Trout. I know you work there, I saw you. Go back there and take up your life again. Tell no one about any of this. Oh, you can talk to Malcolm, of course, but not a word to anyone else except the master of Jordan College. He's a good man. You can trust him. But there are all kinds of dangers ready to pounce when the flood goes down." "What? The CCD, you mean? Why do they want her?" "I haven't got time to explain. But they'll be watching you, and they'll be watching Malcolm, so stay away from her for a while. I'd take her with me into the far north, where the dangers are open and obvious, except for one thing." "What?" "She seems to have found some good guardians already." "She must be lucky," he said no more. Alice took off the earphones. She bent down to touch Lyra's forehead, but the child was fast asleep, with no fever. Greyhound Ben licked Pantalemon's emerald serpent head, and Alice took Malcolm's right hand and closed her eyes. And almost at once, it seemed, they were descending. Malcolm felt a lurch in his stomach and clenched his muscles against it, but it only lasted a few moments, and then the aircraft settled on the ground. The engine noise changed, becoming quieter, and then stopped altogether. Malcolm's ears were ringing, but he did hear the hammering of rain against the body of the gyropter, and heard Lord Asriel's voice above it. "Thorold, stay here and guard the machine. I'll be 10 minutes. Then he turned and said over his shoulder, "Get out and follow me. Bring the child, and bring your bloody rucksack." Alice found a door on her side, and scooped up Lyra before scrambling out. Malcolm hauled the rucksack along, and got out the same side, into the bitter wind and the teeming rain. "This way," said Lord Asriel, and hurried off. A flash of lightning showed Malcolm a great domed building, walls of stone, towers and treetops. "Is this?" said Alice. "Oxford, yes. This is Ratcliffe Square, I think." Lord Asriel was waiting at the entrance to a narrow lane lit by a flickering gas lamp. The rain made every surface shiny. His black hair glinted like stone. He set off down the lane, and after 100 yards or so, he took a key from his pocket and opened a door in the wall on the right. They followed him into a large garden, overlooked by buildings on 2 sides. In one of them, large Gothic windows were lit, showing shelves of ancient books. Lord Asriel made straight for a corner of the garden under a high stone wall, and went along a narrow passage that was lit, like the lane outside, by a flickering yellow light on the wall. "Let me take the child," he said. Alice handed her over carefully. Lord Asriel's daemon, the powerful snow leopard, wanted to see her, and Lord Asriel crouched down to let her put her face next to the sleeping child. Malcolm shifted the rucksack awkwardly, and an idea came to him. He'd never managed to give Lyra the little toy he'd made, but perhaps, "Is this Jordan College?" he said, "as you suggested? Come on, we must be here and gone for this to work." He stopped by a large door set between 2 elegant bay windows, and knocked loudly. Malcolm, ignoring the awful pain in his left arm, rummaged at the bottom of the rucksack for the alethiometer, in its black velvet cloth. The cloth fell open as he brought it out, and the gold glittered in the dim light. "What's that?" said Lord Asriel. "It's a present for her," said Malcolm, and thrust it in among Lyra's blankets. They heard the sound of a key turning and bolts sliding back, and as thunder crashed overhead, the door opened to show a distinguished-looking man holding a lamp. He peered out at them in astonishment. "Asriel, can that be you?" he said. "Come inside quickly. Put your lamp down, master. On the table. That'll do." "What in the world?" When the master turned back, Lord Asriel put the child in his arms before he could protest. "Secundum legem de refugius scholasticorum, protectionem tegimentum, huius collegi pro filia mea Lyra nomen reposco," Asriel said. "For this child?" "Oh, my daughter Lyra, as I said, she's not a scholar. And what about these 2? Asriel turned to look at Malcolm and Alice, sodden, shivering, filthy, exhausted, bloody. "Treasure them," he said. Then he left. It was no good. Malcolm couldn't stand up any longer. Alice caught him and laid him on the Turkish carpet. The master shut the door. In the sudden silence, Lyra began to cry.